Peace. World War II was finally over for the United States, and they were poised to emerge as a world power. However, World War II did a lot of damage to other nations. Before leaving Potsdam, Truman ordered crews on Athena Island in the South Pacific to proceed to their first target as soon as weather permitted. On August 6th, the Enola Gay, a B-29 bomber, dropped a uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy that leveled 4 square miles of Hiroshima, an industrial and military center. The blast immediately killed 80,000 people. One of President Truman's first post-war jobs was to integrate military veterans returning from service in World War II. His first piece of legislation was the GI Bill of Rights, formerly known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. This bill provided benefits for veterans returning from World War II, such as low-cost mortgages, low-interest loans, and tuition coverage for high school and college. During the war and in the years following, much changed in America. The whole landscape of the country changed, both figuratively and literally. This man pictured here is William Levitt, a businessman who mass-produced houses in 1947 when he built a 17,000-house town in Hampstead, New York. He eventually went on to build communities in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and Williamsburg, New Jersey. Levitt's towns epitomized the idea of suburbia, which were residential neighborhoods located outside larger urban areas, consisting primarily of middle-class workers. By 1960, nearly half of Americans lived in these suburban towns. As the United States expanded after World War II, so did the Soviet Union. The bonds that held the Big Three together, that is Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, later Truman after Roosevelt's death, were broken. Hitler was defeated, and there was a vacuum to fill. Who would be the next world power? In addition to military and political differences, both the United States and the Soviet Union faced polar opposite ideologies: free market capitalism and democracy versus communism. In order to ensure that Eastern European countries would not fall under the Soviet control, President Truman issued the Truman Doctrine, establishing that the United States would provide military, political, and economic support to democratic nations under threat from external or internal authoritarian forces. This was backed up by the Marshall Plan, introduced by Secretary of State John Marshall in 1947, which offered financial aid to any European country in order to restructure their economies and revitalize post-war industry. Marshall recognized that communism often flourished in economically struggling economies. Another advocate for containing the Soviet Union's expansion was George F. Kennan, a famous American advisor, diplomat, and historian. Kennan argued that the United States had to contain the domino effect of the growing influence of the Soviet Union over other non-communist countries. Kennan's strategies earned him the nickname the Father of Containment. The first standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union occurred in May 1949, when Joseph Stalin blockaded the border separating East and West Germany. Berlin, partially free from Soviet occupation at the time, was located deep within East Germany, which was occupied by the Soviet Union. The blockade impeded the people of Berlin from receiving necessary food and medication. Rather than risk another world war by firing at the Soviet blockade, Truman decided to use American aircraft to airlift supplies into Berlin for almost a year. Stalin eventually lifted the blockade in May 1949, though this was a crucial step in the solidification of the United States and the Soviet Union as enemies. The final major foreign affairs occurrence associated with Truman is the Korean War. Although technically labeled a police action sponsored by the United Nations in order to stop the North Korean invasion of South Korea, the United States provided half the ground troops, 86% of the naval forces, and 93% of air support for the war. Despite early North Korean victories, UN troops under the command of General Douglas MacArthur pushed North Korean troops back. MacArthur wanted to continue the campaign by chasing the Chinese troops past the Yalu River into China and eventually drop a nuclear bomb on the Chinese. His audacity eventually led to his dismissal by Truman. Although resulting in heavy American casualties, the war helped stop communist expansion into a democratic nation. The United States military was able to push back the North Korean army to the 38th parallel, where the border between North and South Korea still lies today. Domestically, the post-World War II era was pretty much dominated by President Truman. He passed through legislation such as the GI Bill of Rights, which was mentioned earlier, the National Security Act of 1947, which merged the Department of War and the Department of Navy into the National Military Establishment and created the United States Air Force, and Executive Order 9981. which Truman issued in July 1948, ending racial segregation in the U.S. military. Despite many Americans' petitions for a continuation of the New Deal policies of pre-World War II America and Truman's hope for a fair deal for American citizens, there were many critics of the president's domestic policies, such as Ohio Senator Robert Taft, son of the former president, who pushed through the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, effectively giving the president the right to force employees to work during strikes as collective bargaining was negotiated, in addition to weakening the power of labor unions. Due to the slowing down economy, Truman's hopes of re-election in 1948 were dismal. Southern segregationist Strom Thurmond challenged Truman as another Democratic candidate, drawing votes from many Southern states. Thomas E. Dewey, the likable former New York governor, challenged Truman as a Republican presidential nominee. On election night, the conservative Chicago Tribune boldly declared Dewey beats Truman on the following day's newspaper. In reality, however, Truman's hard work campaigning led to an overwhelming victory for the president in the election of 1948. Democrats also gained a majority in the House of Representatives and the Senate. The blue states here represent the states that Truman won, the orange Strom Thurmond, and the red Thomas Dewey. Truman's re-election in 1948 meant the continuation of his policy of the fair deal, ensuring American citizens to national health insurance and massive public work projects, helping stimulate the economy and putting Americans to work, which was the job of the government. The final occurrence under Truman's presidency was the Second Red Scare, propagated almost entirely by Senator Joe McCarthy. McCarthy attempted to weed out the communists, liberals, and homosexuals within the United States government and Hollywood. He issued mandatory loyalty oaths and stirred up fear and hatred within many Americans. Although he did falsify much of his information, McCarthy's fears were with merit. Alger Hiss was convicted of perjury during his espionage trial and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Many other government officials were sympathetic to the Soviet cause, and some were even spies. That said, McCarthy drastically exploited the fears of honest Americans at the expense of nonconformist politicians, actors, and citizens. Truman's post-World War II era had a bright future. The economy was fully recovered from the Great Depression. Millions of men were returning home and finding jobs due to the GI Servicemen Act, and the American dream was alive and well with a growing middle class. The realization of a growing Soviet threat and strong conservative support in Congress soon led to a rude awakening for Truman, however. Despite the difficulties Truman faced between an expanding Soviet Union, domestic radicals on both the left and the right, and a war in Korea, he was able to maintain and lead the U.S. into a position of power and prestige, making him one of the best presidents to ever lead the United States of America.